Let's look at how CSS Grid actually works. So I have this slide for you, and as you'll see, it's actually quite similar to Flexbox. So these are, in my opinion, or in my experience, the most common properties in the context of CSS Grid and some examples of them. So let's start on the left side here. So just like with Flexbox, we have a parent element, which we're going to call grid container, and then its direct child elements are going to be the grid items. So it all starts by selecting the container, the element that you want to be the grid container, and setting the display property to grid. And when we do that, this automatically becomes the grid container, and its direct child elements automatically become the grid items. And this unlocks, so to speak, the CSS grid functionalities. So if you remember from the previous video where we constructed that layout of our app, we first have to construct the grid itself, and then we can place the grid items somewhere in that grid. And we construct that grid by using grid template columns and grid template rows. So here, for example, if we want to construct a grid like this, we can say grid template columns, the first column should be 25 pixels, and then we want the other column to take up everything else. So we can use the fractional unit. This is something new. We don't use the fractional unit outside of CSS Grid, but basically what it means is how much of the available space it should take up. So first, the first column is going to take up 25 pixels, but then there is still some space left, right? That's the available space. And then with the fractional unit, we can determine how much this particular column, this is the second value, so this is going to be for the second column, how much of that available space the second column should take up. And since this is the only column left competing for that available space, well, it's going to take up everything. And it works the same for the rows. So for the rows, we have all of this space here. Right? That's all of the available space. And we want two rows because there are two values here, and they both have the value of 1 FR, so they should both get one fraction of the available space. Right? And since they should take up an equal amount of the available space, right? So the same fraction, they're going to be equally big. And so what you get in this case is actually that the available space is just going to be split in two. Right? So this is going to be row 1, and this is going to be row 2. And another way of looking at this is there are two fractions in total, right? We have 1 plus 1. And so the first column is going to get 1 out of 2. So that's 1 over 2, which is 50%, right? And the second column is also going to get 1 over 2, so also 50%, right? So that's how you construct a grid, right? So we have columns and we have rows, right? So if you've ever used Excel or some other program like that, you may already be familiar with columns and rows. If you've never used programs like that before, it may take a little bit of time before you're completely comfortable with the concept of columns and rows and what exactly was a column again and what exactly was a row again. Well, the columns are vertical and the rows are horizontal. All right, and then just as in Flexbox, remember these properties are getting harmonized. We can also create gutters or space between the columns and the rows by using the same properties actually. So column gap, row gap, gap, it works the same way here, right? So this is all for constructing the grid. And now we want to place our grid items somewhere in that grid. So let's say that I have a grid item here and I want it to take up this space in the grid. Well, I can use these grid lines to place it in that grid. So I can select this grid item and I can say, using the grid lines here, you should go from grid line number 2 all the way until grid line number 3. And for the rows, well, you should start from grid line number 1 all the way until grid line number 3. Right, and then this grid item is placed in there. And by the way, the default behavior is that it gets stretched in all directions. So it's going to take up this entire space here. Now we can be even more precise than that, because maybe it should sit in this area of the grid, right? But within that area, maybe it should be centered horizontally. And so this grid item should be centered in this area that we placed it. So we can be even more precise. And so if we want to center it horizontally, we can use justify self and set it to center, right? So that's horizontally. And then vertically, well, maybe it should sit at the bottom of that area that we placed it in. So we can use align self and set it to end.